Electricity saying it can't be done by 2035.
I'm just astonished that people have forgotten how long it takes to build things. It's just simply not achievable, and we have to be realistic about that.
Coming up, why Alberta is refusing to accept the proposed regulations and what it plans to do if Ottawa enforces them. The province's Environment Minister, Rebecca Schulz, is next. Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault is once again ruling out any further exemptions to the carbon tax.
Well, people should remember that Canadians, on average, 8 out of 10 families in Canada get more money back where the federal system is applied than what they pay in carbon pricing. And the Prime Minister has been very clear. We made an exemption specifically for home heating oil, but there will be no other exemption.
Ottawa has exempted home heating oil from the carbon tax at the urging of Atlantic politicians, but now other provinces want their own relief. Alberta wants a carve-out as well on another key environmental policy, the federal government's clean electricity regulations. That plan is intended to pave the way for a net zero power grid by 2035, and the government's consultation period on the draft regulations ended last night. To discuss Alberta's technical submission on the federal clean electricity regulations, Alberta's Minister of Environment, Rebecca Schulz, joins me now. Minister Schulz, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So Alberta's position on this from the jump has been that the draft regulations were unconstitutional, unaffordable, and unachievable. I've got your submission in front of me. It doesn't look like anything has fundamentally changed, has it? Is there anything new here?
No, I mean, this is still our position that these are completely unreasonable and unrealistic and would have significant risks from both an affordability and a reliability perspective when it comes to our power grid here in Alberta. And so, again, our concerns are similar to what we've heard across the country. Unfortunately, the regulations that the federal government put forward really didn't take into account regional differences between provinces. And so what our technical submission that we provided yesterday does is essentially outline our concerns when it comes to performance standards, our grid reliability, and exactly what we've heard from industry and of course our independent electricity regulator about why these just won't work in Alberta.
You've been saying you can't hit the 2035 target, you can hit a 2050 target. Obviously that's a 15-year disagreement between you and the federal government. We've seen some power generators in your province, Capital Power, TransAlta Corp. They've said they can do 2045, maybe even earlier. Why does it need to be 2050? I mean, can't a province, with the ingenuity and drive of Alberta, do it a little bit faster, even if it's not 2035?
I'll say 2045 is a lot closer to 2050 than it is to 2035. So what we're talking about here is essentially 12 years from now, overhauling our grid, doubling our capacity. First of all, the technology that the federal government is requiring in this first draft of their regulation, it doesn't exist. It hasn't been tested anywhere around the world. And the issue when you have that strict of guidelines being put forward is it's actually having the opposite effect, because with that type of rigidity, no companies want to invest in that technology, especially given some of the criminal ramifications that Minister Guilbeault has put into this regulation. And so, it's going to have the exact opposite impact when we look at technology and innovation in emissions reduction in our grid. And so what we're asking for essentially is some common sense to respect our provincial jurisdiction and our knowledge, quite frankly, in our own grid and how we can get there, allow us the flexibility to work with industry on what that's going to look like between now and 2050. But you know what? These current regulations don't give us any of the flexibility to do that.
Okay, you mentioned the criminal implications of the legislation. I know there's a criminal code component to this, but that is largely to allow for the meting out of significant fines for deliberate and willful actions that violate this, not if there's a system failure and you can't get there. No one is going to be prosecuted criminally if the technology doesn't work out and a best effort is made, right? So you're the only province that keeps raising.
How do we know that, though?
Well, I mean,
how do we know that? And,
have you asked your Justice Department? I mean, you have a Department of Justice in Alberta, and it's only Alberta who's saying this. If the Environment Minister was really passing energy regulations that would see people go to jail, I feel like the other provinces would be raising alarms about this.
I would say that we have a federal government that continues to make decisions out of ideology and completely disregard common sense. And so our power companies and our regulator are actually quite concerned about that. That if we are in the middle of January with 30-degree below zero weather, that somebody is going to have to call Minister Guilbeault in the middle of the night to provide power to Albertans. That is absolutely ridiculous. So what we're asking for, again, is flexibility. After the election, Premier came and said, look, we're going to be at the table in good faith. Let's talk about all of these areas where we have provincial jurisdiction, the federal government has ideas about regulating, and let's see if we can find some common ground or some alignment. But then we continue to see Minister Guilbeault come out and say things like flexibility will not be granted to provinces. And certainly when we saw the drafts of this regulation, they didn't take any feedback from power companies who had been in good faith discussions for the last 2 years from any provinces across Canada. And so that's hugely problematic. And that's why we had to make sure that this detailed submission was, of course, one part of that, but we had to make sure that the federal government heard that message. And now they have the data that they didn't provide when they came up with their draft regulations, but they now have the data and can understand why our power companies, why our independent electricity operator and regulator is concerned about what they put forward.
We have seen arguments, though, Minister, from the Pembina Institute, from the Canadian Climate Institute, from University of Calgary associate professors like Sarah Hastings-Simon, that you can do this if you commit to it and set it as a regulation and increase your renewables, for example, and invest in things like carbon capture to reduce the amount of emissions that come out of the fossil fuel components of the grid, that Alberta will actually be a net exporter of power by 2025, according to some estimates, and the capacity is there if you just commit to it and make it a priority.
I mean, look, we believe in technology, but some of what they're talking about is pure magic. I mean, we cannot base a plan on technology that doesn't yet exist. When we look at the number of grid alerts we had in Alberta last year, I believe it was 7. We've led the country when it has come to renewables investment, for example. Almost 80% of renewables investment in Canada last year were here in Alberta. The issue, though, is you still need base load. You still need base load power. So we don't have hydro like Quebec and BC. We primarily rely on natural gas, right, because there are times when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, and that leaves Albertans and industry in a position where we literally don't have a reliable grid. That is not something that I think Albertans are okay with. And when we look at electricity, we have already reduced emissions in the electricity sector by 53%. And largely that was by phasing out coal. Now, even that came with a cost, $1.3 billion. We're still paying, Albertans are still paying $100 million every single year. That's $100 million that could be going towards healthcare, education, supporting Albertans with their utility bills at a time when affordability and cost of living is one of the top issues we hear about. Right. And so what we're saying is at a cost of billions, some have it marked at trillions, what are Albertans and Canadians going to get, in return? They're going to get a risky grid. And I think that people expect that when they turn on the light in the middle of the night, that there's power for their home.
Right. So on that point, you've talked about the grid alerts you have and a heavily fossil fuel generating electricity system as it is. You look around the world to a country like Germany, which has had problems with natural gas because of Russia and what Russia has done there, but it is one of the biggest mixes of renewables in its grid out there, and it has one of the most reliable grid systems in the world. So isn't it really just incumbent on Alberta to have a good range of asset mix, pumping electricity into the grid and manage it better? Because you've got basically a natural gas grid now, and you're talking about how unreliable it is. Maybe solar, maybe wind, maybe those are ways to make it more reliable because of a range of asset mixes going into it.
Yeah, that's, our independent electricity systems operator has really shown that is a very real risk for us. And it's funny that you point out Germany. I mean, Germany now, they moved so far, so fast. The cost of energy is exceptionally high. And now
that's because of the Russian war, right? And it's because energy has been used as a hostage in that conflict.
and they're moving back to coal-fired generation. I mean, we are still aligned with industry largely on our aspirations around 2050. We want to make sure that we're not putting affordability and reliability of our grid at risk while we get there. And so what we're asking for is the flexibility. I think, we're not the only province that is asking for the flexibility to meet our unique circumstances and make sure that we can continue to have affordable power while making sure we have a reliable grid.
Okay, understood. And look, just as a final question, I would say Germany's using coal because they can no longer get Russian gas because of a whole series of geopolitical issues. But the final regulations aren't due till the end of next year, essentially, or about a year from now. Is there anything Stephen Guilbeault could do to change your mind in the next 12 months? I mean, what would you like to see in the final version of these rules?
I mean, look, first of all, it's still an area of provincial jurisdiction, and we saw that in the ruling just a couple of weeks ago on Bill C-69, reinforce that the generation of power and, of course, development of natural resources, that is purely provincial jurisdiction. So our submission did reiterate that point, but we would have to see some actual flexibility on the technical components of our submission. We have, heard messages from Minister Guilbeault that there will be no special carve-outs or flexibility for provinces. I sure hope that once they read this submission, they see why exactly we can't get there with what they've put forward, why these are so unreasonable, and what the risks are for Albertans and Canadians, and show some common sense. That's what we're asking for here.
Rebecca Schulz, Alberta's Minister of Environment, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.